want to thank everybody, particularly the Consular Corps Association and our contact here, Irina Mazur, who's the Honorary Consul of Ukraine in Philadelphia, for helping us put us in contact and putting this in motion. I also would like to thank the ambassador, who, if I mispronounced her name, I've already pre-apologized to that, His Excellency Sergiy Kyslytsya, who is a Ukrainian career diplomat who serves as the ambassador extraordinaire and plenipotentiary of Ukraine, and permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, which I have been reminded to say it's the United Nations, and Sergiy is not the ambassador to the United States. And he had previously served as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. So with that, sir, the floor is yours for opening remarks, and then we will get into the moderated questions and answers.
Great.
All right.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be on the soil of Pennsylvania and the city of brotherly love. And that is exactly the words that the General Assembly of Pennsylvania used in 1945, when the General Assembly of Pennsylvania passed a unanimous resolution by which they called on President Truman and the then Secretary of State Burns to advocate the establishment of the world capital, by which they meant the United Nations headquarters in the city of Philadelphia. So my trip to you would have been much shorter should the headquarters be established at Ontario in Fairmount Park, which is like 22 minutes drive from here. Unfortunately for you guys, or fortunately, you never know, the Rockefeller family came up with the offer of a plot of land that they bought on the east end of Manhattan, where the United Nations headquarters are now situated. But frankly speaking, I'm very happy to be in Philadelphia. I come to Philadelphia more or less regularly, both for private reasons and for official reasons. I'm always happy to see our consul Irina, and I'm always happy to see my friend Trudy, who is a very dedicated representative of Philadelphia community who travels to the front, to the battlefields of Ukraine. And she recently, it's not a secret, spent quite a number of weeks, not even days, talking to the Ukrainian soldiers in the immediate proximity to the enemy. I'm coming to you today almost on the eve of the high-level week, which happens every year. That's going to be the 79th week, high-level week, when 150 plus presidents and prime ministers who otherwise hate the United Nations, who criticize the United Nations, who say that the United Nations is voiceless, but nevertheless, in spite of all, they all flock to New York in the months of September, which is in itself a recognition of kind of cognitive dissonance they may have. And even our prime minister, who came to New York 2 years ago, and he was standing in the middle of the General Assembly hall, surrounded by 150 presidents and prime ministers, and he said, "Oh yes, indeed, if they are here, then probably this place matters." The United Nations as the only global institution, because the United Nations is the only global institutions where 193 nations are present, is in a deep crisis. And we've been hearing that the United Nations is in a deep crisis for ages, but ever since February 2022, the crisis is only getting deeper and deeper and deeper. I had the privilege to be in a dinner with a good number of my ambassadors fellow ambassadors in New York, and everyone acknowledged that the events of February 2022 became a dividing point, and nobody knows the answers. In spite of it, believe it or not, the signature event of the high-level week in New York this year is the Summit of the Future. So imagine 193 countries that cannot agree on anything. Decided, nevertheless, in the General Assembly, and it is a decision. It's not like, it was like decided by a group of people that we should have the Summit of the Future, that we should adopt the pact for the future. We have less than 10 days before the summit takes place, and they cannot agree on the pact. Ukraine is a founding member of the United Nations, believe it or not. There are various reasons why it happened. Partly because Stalin insisted that Ukraine and Belarus should be independently from the Soviet Union in the United Nations. But it is a matter of fact that it was Ukraine, Soviet Union, and Belarus, founding members of the United Nations. The Russian Federation was not among the founding members. The Russian Federation has never signed, and I use the present perfect tense because until now, the Russian Federation has never signed the UN Charter. The Russian Federation, and it's a very long conversation, continued the membership of the Soviet Union in the United Nations without signing the Charter. But Ukraine is a founding member along with other 49 countries. And the tragedy and irony of the night of the 23rd, 24th of February was that it was the Ukrainian diplomat, the head of the Ukrainian delegation in San Francisco in 1945. And everyone came to San Francisco to write the UN Charter that became the foundation of the organization. It was the Ukrainian diplomat who was in charge of the working group that was preparing the text of the opening part of the UN Charter that is called today the Principles and Purposes of the organization. So when all the principles and purposes of the organization were violated brazenly by the Russian Federation, that was not even the founding member of the United Nations, but that was sitting that night in the seat of the permanent member. The Russian ambassador was sitting in the seat of the permanent member, and I was telling the Russian ambassador when I got the news about the beginning of the invasion, I told him in the middle of the meeting, get your smartphone and go and call the capital, and then come back and confirm that the Russian troops are moving in. So the Ukrainians were feeling particularly betrayed because they wrote the principles and purposes of the organization that were violated by someone who occupied the seat of the permanent member. And I use the word occupied because I believe that the act of occupation of the seat of the permanent member in December 1991 became the first act of occupation by the Russian Federation when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, followed by many other occupations. Occupation of the part of Moldova, Transnistria. Occupation of several parts of Georgia. Occupation of Crimea. Occupation of the eastern part of Ukraine, followed by the full-scale invasion in 2022. So my task in New York is, nevertheless, to make the best out of the United Nations. Because the United Nations remains, as I said, the only global institution, and the Security Council remains the only global body in charge of the security issues. And the United Nations Security Council has been unable to take any decision on Ukraine. There are more than 60 agenda items on the Security Council agenda. And the agenda item on Ukraine is the only one that the Security Council is unable to take any decision. Even on a very divisive Middle Eastern crisis, after many vetoes, the Security Council was able to deliver at least two Security Council resolutions, one promoted by the Arabs, another one promoted by the United States. But you asked me, what if the Security Council passes the resolution that clearly reads, stop the war, withdraw your troops? And that resolution is sent to the Kremlin. It lands on Putin's desk, and Putin received the resolution. He reads, for the highest body, the Security Council tells me to stop the war. Do you really believe that he will pick up the phone and call the defense minister and tell him, look, there is a decision of Security Council, immediately stop the war? No, it will never happen. And it will never happen because the United Nations was set up without real means of enforcement of its decisions. The only thing that the United Nations had compared to the League of Nations that was different is that the veto right. And the veto right was designed in the first place to allow the United States to participate in the new institution, because the US Congress never allowed the US to join the League of Nations, because US Congress told Woodrow Wilson, we would not let you join a structure where we cannot control the decision-making process. And the second primary reason for the veto was to avoid confrontations among permanent members, but not to avoid assaults of a permanent member on a third country, like it happens in case of Russia waging the war of aggression against Ukraine. That is kind of gibberish that I bring from New York, but I'm sure lots of practical questions about the role of the United States, both in terms of the United Nations and in the war that is going on in Ukraine, NATO, Africa, Global South, and all other things. I'm all yours. I'm ready to answer your questions. If I do not know the questions, I will not answer them. And you can fire. Right, so the floor is open.
Well, it looks like we're just going to open the floor to questions a little early, which is fine, and I could disperse my own as we go through. We're gonna just turn the mic on, and we have it usually takes a second to kick on. So please just introduce yourself and then ask your question, as I said, pithily.
Should be on. They're on.
Thank you. I'm Mike Gutman, and my question to you is, how has Ukraine's own attitude towards the UN and more broadly the world community evolved since the war began?
How has it changed, you mean?
Yes.
It's a very interesting and a very complex question, because you need to specify what exactly you want me to tell you about.
That's why I asked it.
Right. Well, Ukraine as an independent state has transitioned in the last 30 plus years, because we renewed our independence in 1991. And we renewed our independence having the third largest nuclear arsenal. So at the moment of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had in its hands the third largest nuclear arsenal. So when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and when the intelligence services of the United Kingdom, of the United States, failed to inform their governments about the imminent nature of the disappearance of the Soviet Union, because President Bush traveled to Ukraine a couple of weeks before our independence, and he was giving a speech that later was called Chicken Kiev speech, where he was telling the Ukrainians, literally a fortnight before the independence, don't even think about the independence, it will never happen. But it was the essence of his speech, because the Soviet Union is so solid and so global, it will exist forever. So when we became independent, the governments of the United States, of the United Kingdom, of Germany, you name it, started panicking, because they were fundamentally afraid of the situation that they were not prepared for when they had to deal with the dissolution of this huge country with nuclear arsenals, weapons, conventional weapons, huge Soviet debt, because they remembered very well what happened in 1917 when Bolshevik Putsch happened in St. Petersburg, and the new Soviet, whatever, state defaulted on the Russian debt, so they wanted to avoid it. And Ukraine entered the international community while already being the member of the United Nations with good intentions. We engaged in conversations and negotiations with the United States, with the United Kingdom, and others, including on the issue of the future of the nuclear arsenals. And in 3 years from the independence, we agreed to sit down in Hungary, in Budapest, and sign a so-called Budapest Memorandum, which we signed, and we said we will let the nuclear arsenals be transferred to the Russian Federation in exchange for the guarantees or assurances, rather, the original text reads, of our independence, territorial integrity, and security. So the memorandum was signed by the Russian Federation, by the United States, and by the United Kingdom. When the war happened, when the war started, we were let down. And the war started when? The war didn't start in February 2022. The war started in the winter of 2014. So today, basically, we are already in the 10th year of the war. The Russians invaded Crimea, part of the eastern territories of Ukraine, and nobody delivered. I mean, the Russian Federation totally violated the memorandum, and the United States and the United Kingdom did not deliver, because they said, well, those were not the guarantees, those were assurances. You know, these semantic discussions are very frequent in the United Nations. You know, it's like Humpty Dumpty. If you remember what Humpty Dumpty said when Alice asked him, how can one word can have so many meanings? And Humpty Dumpty says, the word means what the master wants it to mean, right? So whatever the US government and other governments meant by assurances did not deliver, did not save us from the invasion, did not preserve our territorial integrity, so we were already betrayed. The United Nations was incapable. The United Nations has no way to enforce the principles of the UN Charter. And I remember very well how I was already the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, because I was appointed Deputy Minister in March 2014. And I, in charge of the United Nations, I was working on the draft resolution on territorial integrity of Ukraine. that we put to a vote in March, and we got 100 votes. We were very happy to get at least 100 votes out of 193 in support of territorial integrity of Ukraine. There were many governments and many people in the US government who told us in 2014, do not dare to fight for Crimea. And others were saying, that is the last territorial grab. Just live with it. You know, the same way as Sudetenland was the last, supposedly the last territorial grab for Hitler. And let me recall what happened in 1938. When Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister had a summit in Munich with Hitler, they signed the agreement that part of Czechoslovakia should be annexed by Germany in exchange of a promise that the World War would not happen. Chamberlain arrives to London airport from Munich, and he proudly tells the crowd that meets him, I brought you peace for generations. And the Czech government, the Czechoslovakian government rather, was informed, you know, you have to give up part of your territory in exchange for the peace on earth, peace. And then Chamberlain was saying, believe it or not, why the British citizens should suffer because something happens in a distant, he was speaking about Czechoslovakia, which was in the middle of Europe, and he was saying, in a distant country. So the similarities of what happened in 1938 and what was happening in 2014 and until 2022 are very palpable. We were told, don't dare to fight. That is the last territorial grab. I remember very well my conversations with Secretary General Guterres in the fall and in the winter of 2021-2022, both in his office and in open meetings. I would call on Guterres, I would say, why don't you use the article of the UN Charter that allows you to call a Security Council meeting and to discuss the imminent nature of the war. And he would say both to me and publicly, he would say, nobody asked me. He would say, and you can really Google his public statements. He would say, it's up to Washington and Moscow to agree. To his credit, however, he made a 180-degree turn in the middle of the meeting of the night of February 23. It was still February 23, already February 24 in Europe. And he came out of the meeting and he said, Mr. Putin, stop the war. You know, and ever since he is publicly against the war. But the system let us down. I remember very well, I was sitting with our major allies and partners in New York, the permanent members of the Security Council, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, before the invasion. And I was telling them, the Security Council is vested with the primary responsibility for security around the world. Why don't you call a meeting on that? Why don't you disregard the Russian veto? Because the major thing, as I mentioned, was the veto, right? I veto your decision. They were not up to it. However, they were informing us and they were informing their governments that the invasion will take place. And I remember many, many conversations in New York and in our capital, why and what it means, imminent. And it kind of caused confusion. And the Russians were like, the Russians were manipulating, as Humpty Dumpty, with the word imminent, and the Russian deputy minister was sitting in the Security Council in February, and he was calling that hysteria of the West when the Americans were speaking about the imminent nature of the invasion. And to close my answer, I would tell you, the worst things in the UN history happened during the Russian presidency of the Security Council. The seat of the Soviet Union was occupied by the Russian Federation in 1991 during the Soviet presidency of the Security Council. The full-scale invasion started during the presidency of Russian Federation in the months of February, its monthly presidencies of the Security Council. So when regular Ukrainian citizens, let alone experts and politicians, look at the institution where the major body in charge of security is presided by a country that during its presidency, sitting on top of it in the seat of permanent member, invades another country. How can you sell this institution to your public, to your members of the parliament, and to your taxpayers? So it took me a good while to restore certain degree of respect to that institution. All right.
Question.
Yeah, I think you're next.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. This is very enlightening. I'm Dan Whitman. With the help of FPRI, I'm doing a course on some of the principles of crisis management for 60 Ukrainians who are now in Ukraine. You mentioned Africa and the global south. Support for the cause has been eroding. I don't need to tell you that. And I know that the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry has been opening embassies in Africa. I think that's great. When I think it was the second vote, when we saw that support for Ukraine was eroding among the 54 African countries, Linda Thomas Greenfield, our perm rep, said very harmlessly, she said, we're going to try to make them understand. And she was accused of being a colonialist. Question, what can we do together to get the global south back on the right side?
Right. I will respectfully disagree with you, because the way you present the situation is very dramatic. And the situation is more complex. The first resolution on the Russian aggression against Ukraine was adopted by the General Assembly on the 2nd of March, 2022. It was adopted by 141 votes. Then there were several other resolutions adopted. And by February 2023, which is a year after the invasion, we were already hearing the same kind of narratives. The support is eroding. There is a Chinese plan looming in the air. Why should we support Ukrainian and American and Western and whatever European plans and so forth and so on, whatnot. And we put to a vote a resolution about the underlying principles of just, sustainable peace in Ukraine. The underlying principles of the UN Charter. And we put it to a vote on February 23, 2023. And I remember very well how we were sitting with Linda, Thomas Greenfield, with Barbara Woodward, upstairs, while our principals on February 22 were having a dinner, Blinken, Foreign Minister of Ukraine, others. And in the middle of our conversation, we got the news in Beijing, it was already morning in Beijing, that Beijing released something that we all believed would be a plan. And it happened to be just a set of principles rather than a plan. And nevertheless, when we went to the General Assembly Hall next morning and we put to a vote the resolution that was supposed to just peace in Ukraine, we got 141 votes. Within between, with these, have other resolutions that would have a variable level of support, 90 plus votes, 80 plus votes, even 143 votes. That was on humanitarian issues. You have to understand that when you put to a vote a paper that is based on the principles of the UN Charter, that is based on the notion of condemnation of aggression, on the notion of territorial integrity, sovereignty, you have an overwhelming support. Even friends of Russia will go and vote against Russia. Even friends of Russia would say, no, it's not all right to invade foreign countries. It's not all right to change forcefully the territories. Some of you may remember a very powerful speech by my fellow ambassador colleague Martin Kimani of Kenya,
Best.
who was speaking about how they got their borders as a colonial legacy, but it's absolutely a blasphemy to, It's another thing when you go to the General Assembly and you put to a vote a resolution on how to strip the aggressor state, Russian Federation, of their rights of a member of the Human Rights Council. In that case, you have a situation where a foreign government that never, ever sees itself as an aggressive state now has a different set of points of reference. Now they have to look at their own human rights record, right? And then they go to the Security Council and they have to blame and finger point Russia and say, you are a violator of human rights. And then Russia will tell, who the hell are you? So that's difficult. That's why the resolution on stripping the Russian Federation of the rights of a member of the Human Rights Council was less supported. All right? So I guarantee you, if tomorrow I put a draft resolution on territorial integrity of Ukraine, I will get the same result, in spite of all. In spite of, even in spite of the events of October 7th that significantly changed the dynamics in the General Assembly, right? But when I put to a vote in the month of July a draft resolution on nuclear safety, we got 99. We had to get 100, but there was some technical malfunction, and one country then wrote a letter that they intended to vote. So we got 99 votes. Russia got 9 votes. And I knew that we could have gotten 100, but I really like the feng shui, 99 against 9. We are truly 11 times more powerful than Russia in the General Assembly, right? But then you would say, why only 99? Why not 141, for example, right? But then I have to acknowledge that there was a change of the dynamics after October 7th, one thing. And another thing is that many people believe that nuclear safety, nuclear non-proliferation is a uniting issue, while in fact it is not. And you can pull out very difficult discussions in the first committee and in General Assembly, where nuclear powers are on the one side and many countries of the world are on the other side. So it's not truly a uniting issue. So in other words, yes, it's true that to carry a Ukraine-related resolution now is more difficult than at the beginning of the aggression. But I would be disagreeing with you that the support so eroded that we are losing votes. There are many factors to that, including the fact that the initial surge of support to Ukraine was based mostly on emotions, right? People were disgusted with the fact of the brutality of aggression. Now, countries are very well informed, and even more, now countries really like the feeling that their vote is like a Wall Street, it has perceived value and market value. And believe me or not, cynically speaking, the platform of the General Assembly on many issues is like it's a Wall Street. You want to sell something, others want to buy something, and then you have this negotiation. And many countries are transactional. You can't really work for support on a global scale without giving something. And I'm not speaking even about corruption. I'm speaking about the genuine national interests of many countries that depend on certain actions. And as a chain reaction in the United Nations, there is not a single issue in the United Nations that exists independently, right? And our opponents, including China and others, sometimes more efficient. They are more efficient. In Africa, for example. And I had many conversations both with the US government and with European governments. And I said, you guys have no effective African policy. European Union has loads of money, for example. But you as a third country, as a third world or global south country, cannot get money from the European Union unless you meet certain conditions. Legal conditions, social conditions, economic conditions, co-financing. For many countries to co-finance something is very difficult. But when you ask China, do you want an Olympic-sized stadium? Do you want a hospital? Do you want a highway between the capital and the airport? Seemingly free, eventually, right? Trudy, you want to
Thank
Queue going.
Oh, sorry.
No, you were next in the queue.
Trudy Rubin, what do you hope to get out of, what does President Zelensky hope to get out of this session of the UNGA in terms of attracting more people to the Ukrainian version of a peace plan that's based on territorial integrity? And also, if there is a special session of the UN Security Council on Ukraine, what would be the purpose and what would you hope to get out of that?
Right. The high-level week is not the week when the decisions are made, because the high-level week is officially is a general political debate. So countries come to New York, they take the floor, and it's a marathon of speeches, right? Like, for example, President Biden will deliver his probably last speech as a president in the United Nations on the 24th of September. And we are lucky, by the way, that we speak in the morning of the 25th. And I told my government, oh, we are so lucky that we are. I was asked why, and I said, because, whatever you say after Biden will simply disappear. News coverage of Biden. So for us, it's better to speak on the 25th. So, and indeed, we are working on having a Security Council meeting as well. So we will divide our presentation accordingly, right? It is very important to use that unique global platform to reach out to global south and to countries where we have no diplomatic representation. The Russians have a huge advantage because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they grabbed all the Soviet embassies. So they're basically present in every African capital. While we, until recently, only had 8 embassies, and this year, in spite of all the economic difficulties, we managed to open an embassy in Rwanda, an embassy in Ghana, an embassy in Botswana. So to be there immediately is an important thing, because what happens in real terms, you say something in Kiev or you say something in New York, and then the Russian ambassador picks up the phone and he immunizes the local leadership against your ideas. So we have to be there. There is also this, what I would call, frankly, a competition of different plans, allegedly plans, but as a matter of fact, there is only one plan so far. That's the peace formula. That is a peace formula composed of 10 points. That is the peace formula on which the summit in Bürgenstock took place in Switzerland this summer. And that is the peace formula that we continue to develop, and we have working groups and thematic meetings in the meantime after the first summit. And there was a meeting on energy, followed by a meeting on food security. Now we prepare another meeting on restoring justice, with the aim to have, ideally by the end of the year, a second summit where we would present the Russians with the peace framework that we have to develop together with the partners who have already joined the communique of the Swiss summit. And those are almost 100 countries, with the international institutions that signed the communique, or rather joined the communique. There are more than 100. In the meantime, there are other ideas that in everyday language, people, even some respectable media, call plans, but they're not plans. Because as I said, the set of principles released by China in February 2023, that we all believed would be a plan, appeared to be the list of principles. The Chinese-Brazilian initiative that they call consensus, which is kind of very strange for me. If you just have 2 countries, why in the world is it immediately called consensus? It's not a plan. It's once again 6 points, less than the number of points of February 23. But the fundamental flaw of the Chinese-Brazilian paper that they released on their website, by the way, without even engaging in conversations with us, which is another thing that you never do. I mean, we don't really post your eviction without telling you why the city council wants to evict you, right? So the fundamental problem with it is, even if you compare it with their set of principles of February 23, you will not see there neither the mentioning of the UN Charter nor the mentioning of territorial integrity. And whoever comes up with whatever set of ideas how to bring peace to Ukraine, if that set of ideas has no territorial integrity, it has no chance whatsoever. It has no chance whatsoever, not only because it contradicts the UN Charter, it contradicts the resolution of the General Assembly that was approved with overwhelming majority of 141 votes. It contradicts the wish of the Ukrainian people. And against the possible expectations of Putin, who hoped that the more Ukrainians he kills, the less Ukrainians support the government and the fight for territorial integrity. The reality is reverse. The more Ukrainians are dead, the more families are telling the government our relatives did not die for nothing. And because Ukrainian government is so dependable on the position of public, I can securely say that whoever comes out and tells, let's make territorial concessions, these politicians will be removed from the office almost instantaneously. So without territorial integrity, without sovereignty, nothing will fly. Of course, I can assume China will work very hard to promote their ideas, and I can imagine they may organize certain meetings and consultations. But we should also remember that there is also an African version. And we remember how last year a number of African presidents traveled to Ukraine. They met President Zelensky, and they shared with him their ideas about how they see a peaceful solution can be reached. But once again, for Africans, and I know that, including based on my recent conversations with African ambassadors in New York, the issue of territorial integrity is sine qua non. Because you can't imagine, there are many problems in Africa. But the last thing they really want and need is a territorial war, because it will collapse all other plans that the African governments are working on.
We have about 10 minutes left, so we're going to take 2 questions at a time. So Rick, I know you're next, and I think you've had your hand up.
Hi, Rick Landgraf, Senior Fellow in the Eurasian Program, FPRI. On the issue of Ukraine's future in NATO at the Washington summit this summer, the North Atlantic Council said that Ukraine's pathway to membership is, quote, irreversible, and that the decisions of the North Atlantic Council, the NATO Ukraine Council, as well as the Western assistance to Ukraine constitutes a so-called bridge to membership. How has the Ukrainian government interpreted this rhetoric about irreversible membership and a bridge to membership?
Let's take, sorry, before you answer, let's just take one more so you can 2 at a time.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for coming tonight. My name is Jeff Harth. From 1983 to 96, I was a fighter pilot in the U.S. Navy, faced the Soviet Union, and I watched the Soviet Union fall and hemorrhage nation states and maybe coagulate into what is now the Russian Federation. My question is, we've watched the battlefield evolve over the past couple of years, and it seems like there was Western technology being applied more maybe in electronics and air defenses. But now that we have NATO weapons actually being on the battlefield, do you think Putin's personal attitude toward the war will change and make him, say, more aggressive?
Well, the very simple way to answer your question is that Putin is a sick person. So it's a matter for psychiatry to read his mind. I cannot really read his mind. But speaking seriously, we see almost regularly, gradually, and lately, the gaps between crossing the red lines have become shorter and shorter and shorter. And how many red lines we have crossed in the last 2.5 years? So the next red line will be letting Ukrainians use long-range missiles and other weapons to hit military objects and locations in the Russian Federation. Will he use the nuclear weapons? As I said, Putin is a good subject for psychiatry, and he's a sick person. And he is a sick person, including because he is paranoid about his life. And he was told in a very explicit way, including by the US government, about the consequences of using nuclear weapons against Ukraine or Armenians. The retaliation will be devastating. And you don't really need to use American or British or French nuclear arms to retaliate, because there are many, many other ways to retaliate. In fact, should NATO retaliate against Russian invasion in March 2024, the war would be over in a couple of weeks. Because you cannot compare the cumulative strengths of NATO countries and their armies with the Russian army, and especially at the beginning of the invasion. Because at the beginning of the invasion, the Russian army was not even comparable to what they are today. Because even if we acknowledge the losses, and that those are more than 600,000 of Russian losses, they are learning on the go. And in some aspects now, they are more savvy now, more experienced today than they were at the beginning of the invasion. At the beginning of the invasion, that was a very, it was nothing. Everything was stolen. I mean, that's why one of the reasons why there are so many people in Lubyanka prison today in Moscow, because they lied to Putin, to the commander-in-chief, about the strengths of their army. The West made many fundamental mistakes with respect to Ukraine. In 1991, in 2014, in 2022, the governments were informed by the intelligence services that the invasion was imminent, but the intelligence of the United States and of the United Kingdom failed to inform the governments that the Ukrainians would not surrender. Thank you. Instead, they were telling that the Ukrainians would surrender in a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, right? And that's why the Western governments had no contingency planning. They had no plans how to help Ukrainians and what to supply to Ukrainians. Had they had these plans, the war would be over by today. NATO is NATO membership and the European Union membership is the part of Ukrainian constitution. And that is a very important thing, that is the development since the Revolution of Dignity of 2014. That after long discussions, and it was very difficult, by the way, in case of NATO, it was easier in case of the European Union to make it part of the constitution. But before the full-scale invasion, we didn't have that overwhelming support of Ukrainian membership in NATO. So to put it into the constitution was a very important milestone, because when we have elections after the war, and we will have elections, like Britain had elections. They didn't have elections for 8 years. Now everybody forget that Britain didn't have elections for 8 years. They all ask us, why don't you have elections? Look at Britain. Britain didn't have elections for 8 years during the Second World War, right? We will have elections, and no matter who comes to power, the constitutional demand of membership of NATO and the EU will stay there, because it will be very difficult to reverse it. The constitutional amendments are a very hard thing to do. So irreversibility of this course at the national level and irreversibility of Ukrainian membership, as the Washington decision reads, they are very important things. Is it what we want? No, we want much more. The United States and Germany are not ready. But when the war is over, I can guarantee you that Ukraine will become a member of the NATO alliance. In fact, it's not about integrating Ukraine into NATO, it's about integrating NATO into Ukraine. Seriously, I mean, you may laugh, but it's a matter of fact. There is not a single European army that is as experienced as the Ukrainian army. And the Ukrainian army will remain, and maybe even more stronger than today, for foreseeable future. Because even when the war is over, Ukraine, like Israel, will continue to live next to a very dangerous neighbor. And that is the thing that finally many Europeans realized. And that is why they have this tremendous reinvention of their defense strategies, of their defense budgets. Germany didn't know the number of the howitzers and tanks at the moment of the beginning of the invasion. They had no idea how many people they have to call to pilot aircrafts or to drive their tanks, because they came to the point of total hedonism. Many Europeans came to the point where they believed that their right to holidays is more important than their need to defend themselves. And the war has changed it. Finland is not neutral anymore. Sweden is not neutral anymore. Switzerland painfully revisits its policy. Neutral Ireland realizes that it cannot be neutral anymore. So I really see the future of Ukraine in NATO, and it will eventually happen.
Well, I'm going to take this moment to step in here because we've reached time, and I want to let everybody give a round of applause to the ambassador for his presentation tonight.